The afternoon in Michigan was bathed in gentle sunlight, with fresh air slipping through the automatic doors of a bustling supermarket nestled in a residential neighborhood. Familiar sounds echoed from all directions: the squeaking of shopping carts, the constant beep of barcode scanners, and the soft hum of conversations like the background music of everyday life. Daniel, a tall black man in his early 30s, dressed simply in a green hoodie and jeans, walked into the supermarket with a relaxed smile. As he scrolled through his phone, he pushed a shopping cart past the aisles, casually picking up some vegetables for dinner. Daniel stopped in front of the orange display in the fruit section, reaching out to pick up a ripe golden one. He gently turned it in his hand to check its freshness, utterly unaware of the silver-haired woman just a few steps away, selecting apples. What seemed like a regular grocery run, a small act amid the thousands of rhythms of daily life, would soon begin a confrontation no one expected. A moment that seemed insignificant at first would ripple outward, leaving a deep mark not only on those present that day, but on the entire community. Just as Daniel bent down to pick a few more oranges for his cart, the older woman beside him, in her 70s, with silver hair neatly tied up and wearing a worn beige cardigan, suddenly turned to stare at him. Her eyes were anything but friendly. In an instant, her expression shifted, from surprise to scorn. Then, in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, she spat out a sentence that was sharp and unmistakable. "You people don't belong here." Daniel looked up, thinking he'd misheard. But she didn't stop. She continued, louder this time, more deliberately, as if trying to draw attention. "Why don't you go back to Africa?" The air around them froze instantly, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out. A woman carrying a baby nearby paused mid-step. A young employee stalking bananas stood still, staring. A middle-aged man selecting carrots stepped back, his gaze shifting from confusion to caution. All the usual sounds of the supermarket were strangled at that moment. People couldn't believe what they had just heard, a sentence full of prejudice, callousness, and hatred, spoken openly, in public, in the middle of everyday life, without a trace of shame. Daniel stood motionless, an orange still in his hand. He didn't turn away, nor did he react right away. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of solemnity beginning to form, signaling that the older woman had just ignited something bigger, deeper. A truth that was about to be revealed. Daniel stood still like a statue. The orange in his hand felt heavier, and his fingers tightened around it slightly. But his eyes, those eyes remained calm, profound, as if weighing hundreds of possible responses in just a few brief seconds. The air in the supermarket seemed to thicken. All the usual sounds, the squeaking carts, the barcode scanners, the soft background music, vanished into silence. Every gaze in the vicinity was fixed on a single point: Daniel, the black man, who had just been blatantly insulted in broad daylight. A young employee stalking bananas nearby froze, with uncertainty in his eyes, and unsure whether to step in or step back. At the checkout counter in the distance, a young cashier craned her neck toward the produce section, still holding the item handed to her, forgetting to scan it. A middle-aged man, near the dry goods, muttered under his breath, "What is this? Unbelievable." And the older woman, the one who had spoken the hateful words, still stood there, clutching her bag of apples, chin held high, her gaze unapologetic. She drew a deep breath, as if daring any response from Daniel. To her, this wasn't a mistake. This was something she believed she had the right to say. Daniel still hadn't spoken, but just by the way he stood, by the weight of his silence, everyone held their breath. Because they all knew what was about to be said would not be an angry outburst, but a truth that could no longer be denied. Daniel slowly set the bag of oranges down. He did not lower his head. He didn't take a step back. In his eyes, there was no rage, only the resolve of someone who knew exactly who he was, and who understood he didn't need to shout to prove it. He looked directly at the woman, and his voice rang out, slow, steady, and sharp, like a silent blade. "Do you realize what you just said?" The question carried no hatred. It was more of a reminder, to her and everyone else watching. The older woman squinted, tightened her grip on the bag of apples, and shot back with a cutting voice. "I said what I said. This is America. People like you don't belong here." A sharp exhale was heard somewhere in the crowd, someone trying to hold back their outrage. A woman with a small child quietly led her daughter away from the produce section, trying to shield her from further cruelty. But others stayed. They didn't turn away. They remained, because they knew this wasn't over yet. Daniel took a deep breath and held his tone firm. "All right. You've spoken. Now let's make things clear." He didn't raise his voice, but every word pierced the frozen atmosphere of the supermarket. No one interrupted. No one stepped in. Because everyone could feel. This was no longer just a confrontation between two individuals. It was a collision between light and darkness, between conscience and prejudice. It was a conversation, but one that would become a lesson no one inside that Michigan supermarket would ever forget. Daniel stood tall, his gaze never leaving the woman who had uttered the hateful words. He wasn't angry. He wasn't harsh. But every word he spoke, soft, steady, and deep, carried the weight of an unspoken indictment against the invisible history that had burdened people like him for generations. "My great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he began, his voice low and clear. "He was a laborer on land that wasn't his, working from dawn to dusk for nothing more than the hope of a better life for those who would come after him." The air in the supermarket slowly shifted, from suffocating silence to attentive listening. An older man near the dairy aisle set his phone down, his expression turning solemn. "My great-great-grandfather," Daniel continued, "was kidnapped from his homeland, beaten, chained, and sold like an object, not to build wealth for himself, but to help build this country, the place I stand now, the place where you live." The woman didn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly, yet she clutched her bag of apples tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her gaze wavered, but her lips remained sealed. Daniel didn't back down. He spoke with the voice of a generation that no longer feared, but never forgot. "I don't need to go back to Africa," he said, eyes fixed on her face, "because I never left this land." Those words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a testament, a voice for generations of sacrifice, the voice of those forced into darkness, now stepping into the light. And with every sentence Daniel spoke, the looks from those around him changed, from hesitant curiosity to profound respect. He wasn't just speaking to the older woman. He spoke on behalf of millions who had once been silenced. The supermarket remained utterly silent, but it was no longer suffocating. It was the kind of silence born from deep listening and reflection. Daniel took a deep breath, his voice now firmer, each word etched into the aisles, into every watching eye. "My grandfather was a World War II veteran," he said. "He left his hometown, put on a U.S. military uniform, and fought in Europe, not for glory, but because he believed in America's promise, liberty and justice for all." He paused momentarily, letting those words settle quietly into the air. But when he returned, he couldn't sit at the same table in a restaurant. He couldn't drink from the same public fountain. He had to give up his seat on the bus and live in a world that told him he was less than everyone else. A middle-aged woman near the frozen section slowly nodded, her eyes misting. A man pushing a shopping cart stopped by the aisle, eyes fixed on Daniel. "Even so," Daniel continued, "my grandfather didn't give up. He stayed. He worked. He raised children and taught them to believe in a better America. Not because he was naive, but because he had hope. Because he believed that one day the promises would be kept." Daniel's voice wasn't loud, but it carried power. It carried fire. It carried a faith that refused to be extinguished. He wasn't telling his story to play the victim. He was telling it to remind everyone. Some people had sacrificed entire lifetimes to catch a glimpse of the justice they had been denied. And now, in that very moment, Daniel stood carrying the weight of all that sacrifice. To face someone who had seen him as an outsider, and to speak with all the dignity passed down to him. My family paid the price so that I could stand here, not to be told to return to a place I've never been. Those words, like a gust of wind, stirred something not just in the older woman, but in an entire community that had stood by, silently witnessing. Daniel paused for a moment. He didn't need to look around to know that every pair of eyes was still on him. But this time, he didn't speak of grand things, no wars, no history. He spoke of something more personal, family. "My father is a mechanic," Daniel said, his eyes softening. "He doesn't have a college degree. He's not wealthy. But he's the kind of man who would pull over in the pouring rain if he saw someone in trouble, even someone like you." The older woman squinted, her lips tightly pressed together, but she didn't respond. Daniel remained calm. "My mother is an elementary school teacher. She spent her entire life educating children, black, white, brown, it didn't matter. She taught them to share, love, and stand up when they see something wrong." Daniel's voice wasn't loud, but every word was clear, sincere, and deeply felt. A little girl, walking beside her mother nearby, whispered, "Mom, are there still teachers like that?" The mother held her daughter's hand tighter, eyes brimming with tears. "I was raised in a family that believes in kindness," Daniel continued. "We don't teach our children to hate anyone. We don't teach them to decide who belongs and who doesn't. We teach them that everyone deserves respect, from the homeless person to the CEO." A soft sigh rose from somewhere in the crowd. Perhaps someone had just realized they had forgotten those fundamental lessons. Daniel turned to the older woman, his voice now low but resolute. "And ma'am, if you were stranded on the side of the road, I guarantee you, my father would stop. And so would I. Not because you're right, but because we were raised to do what is right." The space fell still, not with tension, but with a collective pause, a shared moment of reflection, as if inside each person a quiet conversation had begun about how they had treated others. Daniel gently tightened his grip on the shopping cart handle, eyes still fixed on the older woman, not with anger, but with calm conviction and truth. "You said I don't belong here?" he began slowly. "I was born in Michigan. My family has lived here for 4 generations. My great-grandfather plowed fields for white landowners. My grandfather fought for this country. My mother teaches in public schools. My father repairs cars for people in this very neighborhood." He paused for a moment. The older woman said nothing, but the fierceness in her eyes had faded. Her hand, still clutching the bag of apples, trembled slightly. "I speak with an American accent. I pay taxes. I give to charity. I pick oranges in a supermarket just like you. I am also an American, just like you." His voice now was lower, but more potent than ever. "I may be more American than you, because my family didn't just live on this land. They shed sweat, blood, and tears to help build it." The entire supermarket seemed to fall into a soundless vacuum. No one dared to speak. A few people lowered their heads. A middle-aged man gripped the brim of his baseball cap tightly in both hands. A young mother held her child's hand, eyes brimming with tears. The older woman opened her mouth as if to say something, but stopped. Perhaps this was the first time she had truly listened. Perhaps this was the first time someone had forced her to examine her heart. Daniel remained standing, steady, unshaken, and composed. He didn't need to raise his voice, because at that moment, the truth was speaking for itself, clear and undeniable. The silence stretched, then was suddenly broken by a clear, emotional voice. He's right. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap stepped out from the produce aisle. His voice was deep, steady. We have to be better than this. His words echoed across the supermarket like a jolt that awakened the crowd. Right after, an older woman near the frozen section spoke softly, her voice trembling. My father fought in World War II too. He always taught me that skin color doesn't matter. Only the color of the flag does. What had started as whispers now turned into murmurs of empathy. A young cashier, barely 20, called out from the checkout lane. No one's ever handled something like that with such grace. Thank you, sir. An elderly couple near the exit nodded, eyes glistening. A mother holding her child placed her hand over her heart. A silent thank you. And then, applause. At first, a few scattered claps. One person, then another. Then, like a wave, the entire supermarket erupted in applause. Not just for Daniel, but for courage, for dignity, and because in him, they saw something society had long forgotten. Truth and compassion are stronger than hate. The older woman, her gaze no longer sharp, quietly turned away, pushing her cart out of the produce section. She didn't apologize, but her shoulders slumped, her steps slower, and that alone made it clear. She no longer held the same conviction she walked in with. Daniel said nothing more. He gave a slight nod to the crowd, his eyes softening, then picked up his cart and continued toward the checkout lane, as if nothing had happened. But in that supermarket, no one remained the same. Daniel stood at the checkout counter as each item passed under the scanner. The atmosphere in the supermarket had settled, but everyone's eyes remained on him. Not out of curiosity, but admiration. The young cashier, the one who had spoken up earlier, glanced at him shyly, then whispered, "What you said meant something to me." Daniel offered a gentle smile, his gaze warm. Sometimes, what we need isn't anger, but the truth, spoken with compassion. The girl nodded, her eyes shining with respect. No more words were exchanged, but the quiet nods, the soft smiles, the respectful silence, said more than any applause ever could. Outside the supermarket, the golden light of evening stretched across the parking lot. Shadows lengthened under the sun, calm as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Daniel stepped out carrying his groceries, his pace slow but steady. In the far corner, he saw the older woman, sitting in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes staring straight ahead. Her gaze no longer held pride, but confusion, reflection, inner struggle. Daniel paused for a moment, considering whether to approach, but then he stopped himself. Some lessons don't need to be repeated. Some change begins in silence, but it's the kind of silence that listens. He turned away, walking toward his car, and in his heart, a quiet hope began to sprout. Not because someone had apologized, but because he knew the seed of awakening had been planted. That evening, in the small kitchen, lit by soft yellow light, Daniel sat at the dinner table with his father. The plates of food had gone cold, but neither of them noticed. Daniel recounted every detail from the supermarket, the woman's expression, the crowd's silence, and how the applause rang like a bell, shaking people awake. His father, a man with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, listened silently. He didn't interrupt, only resting his calloused hands on the table, fingers intertwined. After a while, he looked up, his voice low but full of weight. You did the right thing. Not just for yourself, but for everyone standing there. People like her might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. Now it's up to time to let it grow. Daniel nodded slowly. He understood that awakening doesn't come in a single moment. It's a journey, one that sometimes begins with a glance, a word, or a silence more powerful than 1,000 screams. At that exact moment, across town in Michigan, the older woman sat alone in her dining room. On the table was a plate of food, now cold. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't angry anymore either. What echoed in her mind were Daniel's words, every sentence, every syllable carved deep into her thoughts. She thought of her grandchildren, children growing up in a world full of diversity. She wondered if one day someone said to them what she had said to Danielle, how would she feel? For the first time in years, she began to question herself. Not because the crowd had turned against her, but because one young man dared to stand firm, not with yelling, not with retaliation, but by speaking the truth with compassion. Daniel's story spread across the Michigan neighborhood in the days that followed. No one called it an incident. They called it a lesson. It is a lesson about courage, dignity, and how to confront hatred without losing humanity. Daniel never sought fame, but when strangers came to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their memories of discrimination, he knew he had touched something greater. And somewhere, in an old house, a silver-haired woman was learning how to peel back the layers of prejudice she had carried her whole life. Because sometimes the most significant changes begin with the smallest of touches.